All right. And with that, it looks like we're at time here. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining. We're going to continue talking through the Infinity Loop and the solutions offering that we have related to kind of the suite of services that we're introducing here today. And in this session specifically, we're going to start talking about what drives event costs within each of these different elements within the loop itself. Important thing to note, though, before we get started is to just do some general housekeeping. Again, this is a 20 to 25 minute Q&A session with Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, please feel free to add those into the chat. The chat feature is the little bubble icon on the left-hand side of your screen. You guys probably already know that by now from the other sessions that you're in, but feel free to send any questions that you have through the chat at any time, and then we'll review those at the end and make sure that we have plenty of time for you to get those questions answered. At the end of this event, we are going to be having actually just one more session after this one, which is a general tour. I'm going to preview that right at the end, but just for your awareness, after you're coming out of this, you're going to join the platform tour, and that will be the final session of the day. In this session specifically, we have a fairly brief agenda, but we're going to do quite a bit of detail work. Karina, if you don't mind, I'm going to do introductions before we move forward here.
Sure.
So at the beginning of this, as we're going through each of these different items, I'm going to introduce Karina, who's our moderator, but I'm also going to have her and kind of call her a co-presenter for this one, because Karina is one of our most experienced estimators when it comes to events at DERSI, and that extends to virtual events as well. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to be kind of kicking some items to Karina for her to put some input in. And generally, she will be monitoring the chat, but she's a great resource to have on board here. So Karina, welcome on board. Thank you for joining. My name is Joe Oakland. I'm the Digital Services Manager here at DERSI, and I'll be running us through the actual agenda that we're seeing on screen here. We're going to continue the overview of the Infinity Loop solutions and talk through some of the drivers for each of the different elements along that. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to do the deep dive into a couple of different elements along that Infinity Loop itself. So number one is going to be virtual journeys. Next is going to be virtual environments, which are very similar in terms of their cost drivers. Then we're going to do another deep dive into live stream events. And then finally, just very briefly, we're going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing from association conferences and what to kind of expect as we're moving towards events going virtual, kind of what the sponsorship packages have been and sort of what the variables are within that as well. So going back to the Infinity Loop itself, I'm just going to focus in on a couple of stops along the Infinity Loop here, and then we're going to dive into those deeper sessions that I mentioned. The first one that I want to talk about specifically is the Hub and Spoke event. That event is sort of I guess it's not a newer concept, but with the advent of so many of our events going virtual, it's kind of expanded its popularity. The Hub and Spoke event is at its core leveraging broadcast capabilities to send out a presentation from a centralized source to remote locations that would host independent kind of spoke events. So you would have, for example, if you were broadcasting from, excuse me, from a live event that was being held out to different regional locations where you might have either a restaurant or a bar that has a smaller number of attendees available to be gathered together in one location. You can still have that kind of personal touch with the spokes, but still kind of keep the overall attendance in one given location down by using a hub and spoke event. So a common sort of example of that would be exactly that. If we were to do this as a hub event, but we had remote locations that are different DERSI offices throughout the country, you could have smaller groups of individuals there that are kind of meeting in person to supplement the hub information. Some of the common drivers that you would have for a hub and spoke type event are the things you would kind of think of just from the initial description of it. So for example, you might have the broadcast cost for setting up the production from the hub. And then you would have the spoke costs that are related to either the event rental site or if you're having hospitality within any of those individual sites. One of the key drivers is always going to be overall attendees. And this kind of will be a theme that we're going to touch on throughout the event here, or I should say this particular session, is that attendance drives one of the key one of the key components of cost for almost any virtual event, which is bandwidth. So no different here with a hub and spoke event. However, in this case, it would also drive some physical costs, like, for example, hospitality. For virtual briefing center tours, this is a little bit similar to the hub and spoke event, actually, in that it is broadcasting from a central location, but in this case, instead of having spokes, it would be wider broadcast. So kind of similar to what we're doing with a live stream event, but it can be set up so it's fully on demand as well. The idea is that you would leverage your existing briefing center space and have video crews who are set up to do high quality production from that space, whether that's through doing live demos or interviews with specific important stakeholders from your organization. Having that set up as kind of a high level of production where you actually have video crews on site will drive a lot of the cost. So the things to think about there would be the level of production value. That's almost always going to be one of your key drivers as well. Similar to what you saw in our keynote session, where we can have kind of a full-blown, almost like news broadcast quality presentation. That can be one of the key factors that can determine how your cost is structured for those virtual briefing centers. Another thing related to that, again, is attendees and bandwidth. That's going to be, again, that theme that we continue to go forward with. But the idea from the virtual briefing centers is that it's something that you can do both live and on demand. In terms of pop-up events and safe exhibits, those we kind of know a lot about in our, as being trade show managers in many of our cases, very similar to what we're already doing right now. But it's a part of that overall blend as we go back to shows and have our hybridized approach to virtual and live events going off kind of in concert with one another. Moving back up the loop, going to infinity mapping, and this is really kind of the starting point. Infinity mapping is one of the sessions, and if you were in Pete and Adam's session, they went into some detail on what this entails, but it essentially is a workshop that is held with key stakeholders within your organization to develop what the overall strategy should be as you come forward with a hybrid approach to not only live events coming back, but in the meantime, while we're doing virtual events, to make sure that all of the different tactics that are being deployed work in concert with one another and ultimately will allow you to reach your audience from the most effective means possible. For the other stops on our our infinity loop, we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the very specific cost drivers. We're going to start off with talking about virtual journeys and virtual environments, and then we're going to go into live stream events. So just a quick note on virtual journeys. I guess a good way of thinking about virtual journeys and what makes them different than virtual environments is that when you're creating a virtual journey for your clients, it sort of is using guideposts to tell a unified story on kind of a pathway for those individual users as they're engaging with the 3D environment. The virtual environments themselves are a little bit more of an open sandbox. So a common example that we've done a lot with so far are virtual exhibits, where we're leveraging the actual virtual exhibit space, but we're kind of challenging our clients to think a little bit beyond the booth and see what you can do to help to tell your story in an engaging way somewhere outside of just the booth environment itself. The real key difference between the two, even though they're both 3D environments, is that the virtual environments themselves, again, are kind of that open navigation where you're able to sort of choose your own adventure as you're going through to engage with different points of interest, versus the virtual journeys, which are really kind of more structured around how a specific story that's being told. So an example of that would be the Massimo example that we've referenced in a couple of different presentations, where we have basically a patient journey that's going to be developed. Initially, we have kind of just an operating room. That's the initial developed environment, but the full scope of that project will take that environment and expand that out to be not only the operating room, but the emergency room, and then the operating room, then post-op and recovery, and then finally the patient going back home. All of those stops along those virtual environments is what create the specific journey that we're referring to there. So while I've talked about the differences between virtual environments and virtual journeys, what we're going to kind of do now is talk about how they're similar in a lot of ways. In terms of the key cost drivers, the main things that you're going to need to take into consideration are very similar between the two. So design and rendering. So what is the environment itself? Are we designing from the ground up, or are we working from existing renderings? And kind of like a sub question to that would be, Are we working with existing 3D renderings for non-environmental properties as well? Something to take in consideration would be different products that are going to be part of the environment. Are we going to have to create renderings around those, or are we going to be able to leverage existing assets? And leveraging existing assets is a really key point of driving cost and making sure that we're keeping cost in check as much as possible. It's kind of looking at, within any organization, what do you have on hand that can be leveraged so that you don't have to create everything from absolutely scratch. In terms of the deployment and platform, is the platform going to be web-based or is it going to be app-based? Is it going to be associate guided or self-guided? So that's kind of going back to a little bit what we talked about with the virtual journeys versus the virtual environments. A virtual journey can really be used as a sales tool as much as a tool that can be used for deployment via kind of web-based means, as we've talked about through Julie and Karina's sessions. There's a real value and opportunity for the virtual journeys themselves to be kind of leveraged by sales teams to help to tell stories in a more almost tactile way, even when they're engaging with individuals in a face-to-face manner and really telling a geared story specifically for the products or services that are being on offer. So back to kind of how that drives cost, understanding whether it's going to be fully self-guided or associate guided will help us to understand what the platform is that will be used for the development and what kind of the framework will be for support. And then the hosting time frame, that's another key development here, or a key component of virtual journeys and virtual environments. We would recommend, by and large, you want to have a long hosting time frame available for the environments that are being created so that you can leverage them across your entire program. A programmatic approach to any of these different stops along the infinity loop is going to be key, because that is how you're going to build an efficiency to the cost that's related to each of these individual items. Moving forward, redeployment and design efficiency, kind of a corollary to that, having a programmatic approach, is understanding how you can use these environments or these journeys in different ways, making them potentially reskinnable rather than hard coding elements in so that they can be changed from either deployment to deployment or from audience group to audience group. Also understanding if you need to have concurrent deployments. So let's say that you have an environment that's being created, but you have two different audience groups that you want to have that are available to access that. We need to know if those are going to be live and at the same time, or if you're going to have kind of a linear path for those items to be available. Last few items we'll just touch on quickly is how does the site, how do you want the site navigation to go? Is it going to be sort of a gamified navigation where you can literally like move throughout the space as though you're an avatar within a 3D environment? Or is it going to be more self-guided where you have waypoints that you can click to and it allows you to kind of semi-fully navigate throughout the space? Or would it be more of a guided tour where you actually literally have a voiceover where a guided host or hostess is allowing you to navigate throughout a space and giving you kind of insight into key portions of that environment itself? Interactivity. So total number of different types of elements that you want to make interactive. So that could be videos, it could be really anything that you would want to have available from any given website, but really we want to focus on the interactivity piece of that as much as possible to make it an engaging environment. But understanding what those elements are and how you want to have those deployed is going to be key, and also the reskinning that I mentioned before. Finally, the integration and measurement. Knowing upfront kind of what the plan is going to be long-term for having these environments and journeys plugged into outside sources for managing clients and so on is going to be critical, as well as understanding what you want to do in terms of tracking specific users and their session data versus data that is captured later. Karina, I'd let you chime in just really quickly here. Is there anything within that you would like to focus in on to kind of highlight in terms of other key cost drivers for journeys and environments?
I don't know. I think really just you need to know when you're planning this that it can be incredibly variable depending on what you want. When we're talking about things like guided tours with voiceovers, if it's just regular tour, a voiceover is less expensive to do than a visual, right? Because one person has a great voice and the other person has to look good. And that's, it might sound funny, but an actor that can be on screen is different than an actor that you could hear on the radio. also consider, is there any linguistic challenges you might have with that? So all of those things can drive your costs. So whether it's video or audio, whether that's it needs to be in various languages, and so on, that'll be really important things for you to consider as you're planning. So these are some of the things that we can help walk you through, and that we see on a regular basis as we're looking at some of these costs. Sign-in forms and surveys. How many? Where do they go? What do you really need to know versus don't try and till the ocean, right?
Yeah.
With that, and then. And especially if you're trying to consider costs and you're trying to consider click-through rates, right? That ultimately will help you, a good ROI will help you get more budget later, right? So there's all of that. And then when you're looking at integration and management, knowing whether that's a data dump that we're just giving you, is that a one-way API or a two-way API? Each of the parts of those bridges, each one is escalating in cost. So if you're okay with taking, a database as CSV and then uploading it into your system, that'll save you more money than having a two-way API into something like Salesforce or Marketo and things like that.
Yeah, for sure. That's all great insights. Thank you very much, Karina. And the variability is really key. And Karina highlighted that, and I'll stress that again. We, generally speaking, will have some guidelines for what we think starting costs would be, as we're seeing on screen here. Starting costs for virtual journeys, 55,000 is a good baseline for a starting cost. Virtual environments, right around 25,000. But that can scale significantly, and that's a starting cost. So the average cost is probably a little bit higher than that for what most projects we'll see are. But the real variability comes in with the number of different elements and different types of engagements that you're building in throughout, in addition to the number of attendees you have and the bandwidth and all the technical concerns related to setting up the infrastructure. As a kind of rough baseline, these are some of the common things that I'm seeing on screen here. And I don't expect anybody to read this slide because it's got a lot of content on it, but I almost put it there in almost a tongue-in-cheek way to say there's a lot that you can do that can both impact cost and increasing cost, or if you're not doing as much of this, it can decrease cost. So keep in mind the variability of each of these different items, especially when we're talking about something like a virtual journey or a virtual environment, that the sky is truly the limit in terms of what you can do. You can imagine it can be done, but there's going to be costs associated with each of those things. So shifting gears over to talking about live stream events, we're going to follow a similar format here. I'm going to detail a deep dive into some of the core elements of the live stream events themselves. But a live stream event, just to give a little background for what we're talking about, is something like this. This would be considered a more robust live stream event than some of the other live stream events that we've done, where it's a little bit more of a hyper advanced version of what you'd expect from like a Zoom meeting or a GoToMeeting that you might join on a regular basis, where it's a full professional broadcast, similar to the quality of broadcast that we showed earlier with Adam and Rick going through the keynote address, where it's a very highly produced event that can go out to many individuals. When planning live stream events, probably the most important factor outside of the number of attendees that you're going to have and bandwidth concerns is going to be the level of production value itself. That's a big sliding scale that you have that can determine not only if you're doing a live event that's going to be recorded and what that live event recording cost will be, but also then the post-production for that. Things related to editing film and making film. It's dating myself. Editing recorded video to allow you to have a more kind of finely tuned, polished product that's going to be live on demand for a longer time scale. That can be really important if you're looking at how long you're going to have a live stream event live after the event is completed. If you're going to have a really long tail, that kind of means that you probably are going to want to spend some more of your budget on making sure that the production value and the post-production value is really high to make sure that that looks like a high quality produced event. Number of attendees we talked about before. Bodies equal bandwidth, and bandwidth is typically one of the core cost drivers that you're going to have for any virtual environment. So that's really key. One of the tips that we've had is to potentially even cap the number of attendees you're going to have for a live event, and then redistribute on demand to help to reduce the number of individuals that you're going to have to pay for out of your budget if you have a more limited budget. That's a really key factor again here. Again, the event schedule. So for an event like what we're doing right now, this is a one-day event over a few hours. So the time's it's fairly tight in terms of the overall timeline of production. But if you're doing a multiple day event, that can really significantly impact the amount of time that it will take. Other items to take into consideration: number and type of sessions, whether or not you're having exhibitors. Sometimes if you're doing more of a or sponsors, I should say, if you're doing more of an event that's going to be like a proprietary conference where you may have sponsors or outside exhibitors that you want to incorporate in, that can drive cost as well. And then the number of features, and I'm not going to read this all off because we're getting a little bit into the details too much on some of this almost, but just understand that, like what we talked about with virtual journeys and virtual events, the number of different features and functions that you build into the platform that's being used for your live streamed events will impact costs significantly in terms of both budget, planning, project management, and so on. The other element that's something we just want to make aware that we're seeing a fair amount of is the distribution of speaker care packages, which is kind of like a DIY studio in a box for a scenario where you're having speakers who are going to be working out of their home during kind of the COVID era, providing them with a higher quality camera, quality backdrop, and so on to allow them to have, again, like a little bit of a finer touch to what the final product will look like. Starting range here again, this varies pretty widely. Starting range is around 15,000 for what you'd see for a live streamed event. But again, depending on the level of production value you're going to have, the number of days, the number of sessions you're going to have, that can vary pretty significantly up from there. Average would be probably much higher than 15 on average. However, you can, depending on the amount that you're doing within your event, we'll go closer to 15. And then finally, before we go into the Q&A, just very quickly, I want to talk about what we're doing or what we're seeing with association conferences, and give a little bit of insight to those of you who might be seeing what's happening in your industry. Just kind of spread that out a little bit to speak to what we're seeing in the wider industry. Probably the most common thing that we've seen, especially in pharma and healthcare in general, is there's a core focus on preserving and translating the education that's provided from the virtual event, or I should say from the physical event into the virtual event. That's really the key that most associations are focused on. And sponsorship packages and virtual exhibits are something that is an important factor, but it kind of is taking a backseat to that, is what we've seen so far. So what we've, and within the sponsorship packages that are offered, very, very widely varying degree of functionality and capability that is available for a top level sponsor versus a lower level sponsor. But usually the types of things that you'll see are like whether or not you can have meetings scheduled within the event, or can you have outside links hosted to that will take you to different resources available throughout. A number of different factors to play in, but the real core of why I wanted to touch on this is that what we found is there's a lot of inconsistency between how associations are approaching what they're offering. And we're hearing from a lot of clients that they're kind of waiting to see what's happening with the association before they make a determination on what they're going to do in the virtual event space. And really the best recommendation that we've come to is, based upon what we've seen so far, if you're waiting for getting a determination from an association on what they're specifically going to do, in some cases they're waiting to the very last minute to make determinations, and they ultimately will have you'll put yourself behind the 8 ball, basically, if you're waiting for the association to determine what they want to do. So the best practice would be to have a unified strategy around what you want to do prior to seeing what the association is going to offer, and don't rely on the association solely as the delivery mechanism for accessing your outside virtual environment or virtual event or virtual journey. Looks like we're getting right at the end of our time here. So Karina, were there any questions that had come in through the chat before we wrap up with key takeaways? Oh, you're on mute, Karina. Karina, you're on mute.
And one of the questions that came in, I just want to say it verbally in case somebody else had that question, was, is this session available for later? In the next couple of days, the clean edited versions will be back on this site for on-demand viewing and download. So you will be able to have that without any issues. Are we, do we have any, I got a text question that said, hey, do you have any ways to control costs, or how can you help us control cost? One of those things is, when we're helping you plan your event, we can definitely help you identify what some of those cost drivers are when we help you construct it. So if there's a budget that you're looking at, let us know. Sorry about that. I've been talking a lot. But a couple of things that, we might mention is, like, if you had a really big crowd you're broadcasting to, we might recommend using syndication for the larger group, because then you're using less bandwidth and therefore paying less money. So, so there's a lot of different ways that we can help you with addressing that.
Excellent. So key takeaways from this session in general is that cost is a highly variable component of planning your virtual events, and based upon the specific solutions and tactics you are defining, that cost can go from sort of that starting range that we saw significantly upward from that. But if you have budgetary guidelines that you're trying to follow, doing some of the things like Karina had mentioned about syndication of broadcasts to reduce the overall number of attendees, we can definitely help to determine how we can get a solution to fit the budget that you have. Identifying the targeted tactics.
Another question.
Oh, sure.
One is, can you support just one live meeting for a virtual expo hall, or do we have to buy a whole big package?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Karina.
One.
Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you were going to answer that or not. Yes, absolutely. We can do that for a single kind of exhibitor or a single partner, or we can do it for multiples. That's really variable based upon the need. We actually are even doing this for full associations as well. So it scales all the way down to the smallest element, all the way up to the biggest element that we can support. Second key takeaway is understanding what the tactics are that you want to deploy, and we would recommend doing the infinity mapping session through that specifically, because that will help to narrow the variables. There's a ton of variables, as you can see when we start talking about cost here. So by doing that infinity mapping session, that can help you to narrow those variables down and start to understand what the key cost variables are that you need to associate with your goals to match your budget. So kind of doing triage of the different elements. You might want to do everything under the sun, but your budget may not allow it. So understanding those key tactics that are going to be most important to your target audience can really help with determining that. And then finally, planning programmatically for your hybrid solutions to maximize efficiency. Understanding at kind of the beginning how big this project might be or how much you might want to do with it can really help to remove or reduce the rework that would happen if you're kind of redesigning as you're going along. So having a long-term approach to how you're going to use any of the stops along the virtual or the infinity loop is key, but even more so, I would say, for the virtual journeys and virtual environments where you may have a significant timeline where you're going to be reusing those tools, and understanding what you want them to look like in the end can help you to then determine what the key variables are you need to plan for at the beginning so you're avoiding rework. So we're getting right to the end of our time here. Thanks for hanging out and learning a little bit about the key cost drivers. This presentation will be available starting on the 13th. We're going to be posting all these presentations live because I know I personally talk fast. I try my best to not talk quickly, but there's only so much I can do. But there's a lot of content that we covered very quickly here as well. So we want to make sure that you have the ability to access this on demand so you can review all the content. But more importantly, if you have specific questions, please reach out to us, because as we've stressed several times, everything that we've talked about today is variable. So while we provided some guidelines, it really will make the most impact for you and your organization to have a conversation that can help to give not only guidance around what are some of the tactics and things that work well for your specific needs, but if we're talking about doing things like infinity mapping, where we're starting to help with strategizing around what tactics you should deploy, that's a good starting point, is just to start a conversation, and we'll kind of help to determine what we want to do for next steps from there. So the next stop for everybody here is the final platform tour that's going to be starting in just a few minutes. When joining the tour, you're able to do that from your personal agenda. So everybody should have been signed up for this automatically. It's already in your personal agenda. So after you leave this session, jump into that personal agenda, and then from there, you're going to go ahead and take the tour, where Kyle and Rick will take you through kind of a final run through of the platform itself, and answer any questions that you have around what you've seen today in terms of the full functionality and full capabilities of the system. So again, thank you all for joining, and thank you for sticking through. It's been, we've gone through a lot of information here, but if you feel like you need to go back and review something, as I mentioned before, we're going to have all these sessions on demand starting on the 13th. So you can come back to this site and review any of the content and the presentations that we've posted here. So thank you very much.